Okay, good morning or good afternoon, everybody. It's Tim Richter. I'm president of the Canadian Alliance to End Homelessness, and I am thrilled to be here with you today hosting this webinar on our new report, Proposals to Strengthen the National Housing Strategy and End Homelessness. That report was issued this morning and will be available on our Recovery for All website. We will show you where to find that in a second. Our agenda today is pretty straightforward. I'm going to do just a brief introduction of the report and of our presenter, Steve Pomeroy. Steve will go through a presentation that'll discuss the report in detail, and then we'll hold some time for question and answers. We should have about half an hour to get through everybody's questions. So a couple of housekeeping items. First of all, this is a very big, very busy webinar. We've got over 500 people registered, so everybody is muted. If you have a comment, you can leave them in use the comment or the chat function. But to ask questions for the question and answer period, we're going to be doing a moderated Q&A. So I will be asking Steve the questions that are written into the question and answer panel. So use the tab on the Q&A tab on your control screen or your control panel there to ask questions. We should have about a half hour for questions. And while you're on the report or while you're in the webinar, or if you have you want to download a copy of the report, please feel free to do so. It's at recoveryforall.ca/report. So really quickly, so in April, we commissioned Steve to develop a detailed and costed roadmap of measures to implement our 6-point plan. When we launched the Recovery for All campaign, we wanted to make sure that we had a clear roadmap for the federal government to implement, and a clear roadmap for ending homelessness. Steve is one of Canada's, if not the leading expert, one of Canada's leading expert on housing policy, and we spoke to him about developing a roadmap of measures to implement the plan. Our objective is to end all homelessness in Canada, to achieve a functional zero effectively on all homelessness in Canada by 2030. And by functional zero, I mean that by the time we get to 2030, there may still be people that have emergencies and fall into homelessness, but we want to ensure that homelessness is prevented wherever possible for everyone. And if people do become homeless, that their homelessness is rapidly resolved, so that we have homelessness by 2030 is rare, brief, and non-recurring. If you're like me and tend to zoom into the headlines, there's a few things I want to highlight about Steve's plan and about our Recovery for All strategy. First of all, we're calling for targeted spending of $52 billion over 10 years. You'll know that Canadians spend about $7 billion a year on emergency responses to homelessness. So this plan we expect would generate savings to taxpayers about $18 billion over 10 years. The plan, as I said, is targeted to ensure housing for all those currently experiencing homelessness, as well as preventing homelessness for over 300,000 households at high risk due to housing costs and precarious situations. We're talking about, one of the things, given that the context here is COVID, we've designed into the strategy a number of measures that will allow for rapid creation of housing and rapid movement of people out of homelessness or prevention of homelessness quickly. Steve has outlined a strategy for 75,000 units of acquisition, conversion, or construction of modular housing. We expect that we would be able to increase national housing strategy, housing construction, to over 370,000 units. Currently, they anticipate about 150,000 units. We've included included provision for a distinct urban Indigenous housing strategy, and notionally set aside approximately 30,000 dedicated units. Part of our strategy for rapid housing of people includes a homeless housing benefit with a minimum 55,000 people, or 55,000 housing benefits, and a minimum 55,000 people avoid or exit homelessness. Of course, it would be many greater than that, as housing benefits are often used temporarily. We're also calling on the expanding direct federal investment to community responses by the expansion of Reaching Home, including specific new investments in rural and remote homelessness and women's homelessness. And finally, I think one of the benefits of this plan is to help the federal government realize progressive realization of the right to housing, and ensuring that the National Housing Strategy is in fact compliant with the legislative right to housing in Canada. Now, it's my pleasure to introduce Steve Pomeroy. I won't go through his bio in detail, but I will say that Steve is recognized as one of Canada's leading experts, if not Canada's leading expert in housing policy. He's sought out by all of our peers in the housing sector, national associations, municipalities, provinces, and the federal government, which shows that he has a very unique expertise, and he's currently a senior fellow, research fellow at the University of, he is a fellow at the School of, senior research fellow, CURE, at the Carleton University Centre for Urban Research and Education. So without further ado, I am going to stop sharing and allow Steve to take over and carry on. Over to you, Steve.
Thanks, Tim. And hello, everybody. I'm just going to get my PowerPoint up here. All right. Slideshow. Make sure that comes up. All right. Are you seeing the detailed one or the other one, Tim? Do I need to change my swap displays?
You're on good. Your presentation is there.
It's good.
Just the presentation, yeah. Yeah.
All right.
Away you go.
So as Tim indicated, I'm going to basically go through the report. I think it's been up online since this morning, so I'm sure some of you diligently pulled it down and have already read it, and hence there'll be tons of questions, I imagine. But for those of you kind of like my students, I assume 1/3 read things, 1/3 browse things, and 1/3 don't bother. For the last half of that group, I'll assume you haven't had a chance to review it and give a bit of an overview. So basically, as Tim said, obviously, the context we're in is in the context of the pandemic, thinking about two things. One is the extent to which the pandemic has revealed, the significant vulnerability of the homeless population, and so the reality that the mantra "go home and stay home" doesn't resonate very well when one doesn't have a home to go to. So we're sort of leaving off that, and also to the extent that the government or all governments across the country, municipal, provincial, and federal, are starting to think about what happens, ideally post-COVID. How do we re-stimulate the economy, and how do we make sure that we create responses that create synergies in terms of addressing serious policy and social policy concerns, while also stimulating the economy, creating employment, that kind of thing. So we're sort of leaving off those two things. I think, even prior to the pandemic, there was recognition that the allocation of funding, given that the National Housing Strategy had two primary goals: reduce need by 50% and reduce chronic homelessness by 50%. Yet the homeless piece was only 5% of the entire budget, 2.1 billion. For Reaching Home. That's not to say that other parts of the housing strategy couldn't be used in terms of some of the capital funding programs and lending programs to develop affordable and supportive housing. Although I think the way they're currently structured, they don't really lend themselves very well to the supportive piece, just because of the subsidy gap that's required. So really, we're trying to push that number up. The reality being the National Housing Strategy was a good start, and I think we need to progressively over time ramp up the funding levels to the point where it can actually achieve its objectives. And beyond that, the Alliance, as Tim has indicated, have set a higher goal that beyond ending chronic homelessness by 50%, which is the National Housing Strategy goal, the Alliance would like to see the end of all homelessness by 2030. And so that's the basis for which I was asked to do the analysis. So in terms of looking at the issue, we first need to understand what's the problem, what's the scale and nature of homelessness, both those who are currently homeless and those who may become homeless as a result of various phenomena, and therefore they are at risk. How do we then basically identify responses that would respect the fact that we've got a diversity of types of need and types of risk, with the objective of eliminating homelessness, and this also means how do we accelerate the flow of folks who are currently in the homeless system into stable housing, and how do we slow and ideally stop those folks who are at risk becoming homeless, and then what are the various program options and costs of doing that. So I suspect I'm preaching to many of the converted here. Many of you will understand quite well what the characteristics of homelessness are, and the fact that there is a diversity of characteristics, including both those who have substance addictions, mental health challenges, as well as many whose main issue is one of lack of income or low income, combined with the insufficient supply and availability of affordable housing. So we kind of got two general groups there. And also because we're trying to frame this in the context of a post-COVID stimulus response, we have sort of phased some of the recommended initiatives around what can we do quickly to ensure, in particular, that those who have been temporarily housed in hotels, motels, to avoid congregate living that occurs in shelters, that we don't just dump them back into shelters at the end of the beginning of recovery, at the end of the crisis. So that's a very key emphasis in the plan. In terms of sort of just conceptually framing what we're talking about here, I mean, one could configure the left side of this, the one-time homeless, as really the preventative side. We've got, there are 443,000 households in core need that pay more than 50% of their income for rent. So those high shelter cost burdens mean that they're living very precariously. They're one paycheck away from being in arrears, moving into eviction, alongside a whole bunch of other issues, certainly the stresses that are associated with high shelter cost burdens, and various other contributing factors that I don't need to go into, that result in folks presenting at a homeless shelter or family shelter due to various issues. And this is really our inflow into the system. Those who are immediately assisted, diverted through various mechanisms, which we'll come back to, don't end up being homeless. Those who are not assisted spend time in the emergency system. The longer they spend in the emergency system, the clock ticks over, and they then move into the right side into becoming chronic. And really, that's the flow we're trying to slow down. And then the chronic numbers, ESDC, their most recent estimate is around about 27,000 of chronic homelessness. That's a static number, and it doesn't reflect the fact that it's a highly dynamic population. Some folks move out of the shelter for a while, they disappear from the system, subsequently they come back, some are housed, some not successfully housed and come back, and then we have the new entrants coming in. So there's a constant churn going on there, and without getting into the details in the paper, I try to sort of develop some estimates of what those numbers may be, and in addition to the 27,000 that are chronic on one particular day, there's probably up to about another 23,000, for a total of 50,000 that are essentially in that chronic population. And that's why we need to basically frame responses around 50,000 chronic plus the other folks that are coming in. And the intent there is to essentially accelerate the flow out of homelessness, and particularly out of chronic homelessness. So there's two priorities. I'll come back to these in sort of the specific details of the initiatives that are associated with them. But clearly, if we recognize that the vast majority of folks who do present as being homeless are there for economic reasons, those that are in and out quite quickly, like low income and or lack of access or lack of availability of appropriately lower priced affordable housing, and in some cases supportive housing options, then we need to basically increase the supply of those options. Key issue, if it's affordability, it's very difficult to house someone in a Housing First program, as I'm sure many of you are aware. on the kind of the income levels that folks typically would have on various provincial income assistance programs. And therefore we need to supplement and complement that in order for them to actually have any kind of ability to find and secure housing in the marketplace. And the expanding prevention and diversion is especially important if we're looking at it slowing the inflow into homelessness in the first place. And we'll come back to these in various details. On the outflow side, obviously, again, capacity to pay, the Housing First example I provided, very difficult to execute the Housing First strategy without sufficient income to pay the rents that are available in the marketplace. Back to the objective of doing things quickly, looking at selective acquisition of various properties. In particular, we've seen in BC they bought 6, last count anyway, 6 motels, hotels. Yellowknife, the housing society there, has purchased a motel, and I think other communities are looking at the same thing. The modular housing example that most people are familiar with in BC, obviously something that can happen quite quickly, much more quickly than regular development, and then subsequently complementing those two very fast measures is looking at ways to expand the production of permanent supportive housing of various kinds as we go forward. And that doesn't mean to say we stop doing acquisition and we stop doing modular, but we want to look at getting it into a blend of those kinds of things. In terms of really putting an emphasis on where the problem is, the lack of lower cost stock is a real impediment both to facilitating Housing First and for folks at risk finding an appropriate place to live where they're not going to end up running into arrears, evictions, and becoming homeless. So this chart basically is the distribution of renter households in 2016 census compared to the distribution of the rental stock. The orange column would be based on the incomes, how many units are required. So less than $500 a month, that would be folks with incomes up to $20,000. Up to $30,000 would be $750, etc. And the blue columns are the number of units in those particular rent ranges. And we can see there's a shortfall about just over 360,000 in the low rent range. So clearly not enough units there, and very difficult to find a place to live if you're coming out of the shelter. Or moving within the existing market, you've been evicted or something's happened. While the National Housing Strategy is putting a significant emphasis, $13.75 billion on rental supply, that rental supply, the Rental Construction Financing Initiative, is really only creating rental units above 1,500, in many cases above 2,000 units a month. So while it's creating supply, which can have some effects in the housing market and raising vacancies, it's not really directly affecting the population that we're talking about today. So it's sort of an ancillary program there. The other part of the issue, and probably the most acute issue we're facing, I think, in Canada's housing system today, is not only do we have very few units at the lower end of the rent distribution, those we have, we're losing very quickly. This chart is looking at the difference between 2011 and 2016 census and the number of units, the change in the number of units in each of these rent ranges. And we can see that for the units renting below $750 a month, so up to incomes of $30,000, it's roughly evenly split between those below 20 and below 30,000. We lost 320,000 units of existing privately owned and operated rental housing in the rental market. Some of those units, when I say lost, we have actually absolutely lost them. And to some extent, municipalities, I think, need to think about their policies around intensification and transit-oriented development and those types of things, because it's as good as it is for the environment to intensify and constrain growth, if it comes at the cost of intensifying in the inner city, which is where a lot of the moderate rate rental units were built in the 50s and 60s in our inner city areas. If we're knocking down a 3 or 4 story 30-unit walk-up to build a high-rise condo, we're basically getting rid of that stock. So planning policies really need to think quite carefully about how they promote intensification. And an intensification policy in the absence of a rental replacement bylaw is a recipe for a disaster, I would suggest. So I think we need to look at that particular problem. But the other issue is the significant increases in rent levels. So the units are not absolutely lost, they still exist, but they're now existing somewhere else in the rent distribution, and they've moved from being at the low end, and they're now over in the sort of $1,000, $1,200 a month range, and they've moved beyond being affordable. And that process is one that's being driven by low rental supply, low vacancy rates, opportunities to increase rents, particularly through vacancy decontrol. In Ottawa, for example, last year we saw the average market rent went up by 8% year to year. But for the units that had been vacated, it went up by 18%. And Ottawa is one of the worst examples in the country last year, but that same phenomenon is being repeated across the country. And on the backs of these very high potential rent increases, you've got large capital funds and even small rental investors purchasing these assets with the opportunity to see significant increase in their yield as an investment asset. So the so-called financialization of the rental market is a serious problem, and one that we'll come back to in terms of some of the solutions we need to be thinking about. So in terms of the specific options, proposals that are included in the paper. Essentially, there are 9 of them, so I'll quickly go through each of them. The first, increase people's capacity to pay. Obviously, the pandemic situation and wage replacement, wage stabilization through the CERB in particular, has reignited, I think, interest in developing a guaranteed basic income. We sort of seen what happens when we stabilize people's wages and enable them to pay the rent. So there certainly is strong advocacy to push into that area, and certainly the Alliance, I think, is strongly in support of doing that. Being a pragmatist and realist, I think that could take some time to get in place, and how can we actually move quickly? The Canada Housing Benefit was announced as part of the National Housing Strategy in 2017, and it was implemented in early April of this year, was intended to be implemented. It's certainly still in that phase of implementation, depending which province you're in, and it's being done through the provincial and territorial housing agencies. But because it's there, it's easier to tweak and retarget it a little bit. Some provinces like BC are already using the housing benefit funds to actually target as a homeless priority area. Other provinces ideally will come on side to do this kind of thing as well. So we're suggesting that we could either take a specific allocation of the 300,000 households that are already budgeted for in the housing benefit and direct them specifically as a homeless housing benefit, and or if provinces weren't willing to do that, then have the feds essentially augment it with a federally funded homeless housing benefit. The intent being to immediately provide assistance to those 10,000 households that are currently in temporary accommodation, and ensure they don't go back into the shelter system. We get them housed, and we provide the financial resources to enable them to be housed, leaving aside the fact that the available stock of low rent units is somewhat limited in many locations for the reasons I just noted. So the other way of doing this is if there are limited opportunities out there, we need to create more opportunities and acquiring properties that lend themselves to supportive housing. Certainly motels and hotels have a configuration with self-contained unit rooms with a bathroom, and in some cases kitchenette, particularly in the motel type accommodations, and these could be a ready target. And the fact that one of the consequences of the pandemic is that there are very few tourists, and therefore many motel and hotel properties are in serious financial stress, and so it's an opportune time to be opportunistic in purchasing some of these assets, as is being done, as I mentioned, in BC and other jurisdictions. At the same time, student accommodation historically, again, I'll use the Ottawa example because I know the circumstances here. 15 years ago, we had over 3,000 properties of rooming houses, and that's now less than 1,000. A lot of those have been bought up and used either in short-term rental accommodation, Airbnb, and or student rooming house type accommodations. Airbnb is obviously not happening for the lack of tourism reason, but also because many cities are basically now regulating short-term rentals and limiting them to units with spaces within an existing house as opposed to self-contained units. So some of those properties could become available. And secondly, the students who are most universities across Canada will continue to have online courses through the fall. Significant decline in student demand, and some of those properties may be available as well. So I think we can be opportunistic in looking at those kind of things if we had a funding program that enabled the non-profit sector supportive housing sector to act quickly to acquire some of those properties. Currently, the National Housing Strategy does not have a funding program that really enables this. So it needs to be refined and tweaked to specifically enable this kind of activity. And we think, probably up to 5,000 units, and ideally a couple of 2,000 or 3,000, in the initial year, would not be an unrealistic target in order to create opportunities for supportive housing providers to have a place to provide services. Continuing in the theme of things we can do quickly, I think the experience in BC has now been well documented in various media and research and so on. Their ability by using modular or manufactured units and then sticking them together like Lego blocks, they were able to create 2,000 spaces for permanent supportive housing in only 1 year, which is much faster than going through the planning development process to build on site, which is generally a 3 or 4 year process. So certainly this particular approach lends itself again to a very fast response in a post-COVID kind of world, and also is quite complementary with strategies around creating employment. We can take a bunch of labor that is now not being used, and particularly if we think about the resource provinces out in Alberta, we were creating a lot of modular units for worker camps in the oil sands. There's obviously no demand for worker camps in the oil sands anymore. Can we redeploy those factories to create modular units and have them contribute? Auto plants have closed down in Ontario. It's fairly easy to convert a production line from building vans and cars to building modular units. I say easy, quote unquote. I mean, certainly, the industry is quite good at doing those kind of things. And so we can create, employment stimulus through doing this as well. And given that Vancouver did 2,000 units in a year, City of Toronto is now proposing to do 1,000 units in this year and is immediately doing 250. I don't think it's unrealistic that we could easily get to 4,000 units within a year across the country and replicate that for a couple of 3 years. It doesn't have to tail off if that particular product proves to be quite useful. We don't necessarily need to stop doing that and just build on site. We continue with a blend, but for the purpose of costing, we sort of use specific numbers of 4,000 a year and then going off to 2,000 a year after year 3. And then the fourth piece or the third piece of building, creating more permanent supportive housing opportunities, building on those two, the acquisition and the modular, is to do the traditional stick built. Some cities like Calgary have perfected quite an elegant design for infill type units on 50-foot lots where they can build 20 to 30 units, and it infills quite well. And that's sort of a scale that's quite workable for in place supports for supportive housing without being too big. And certainly, replicating that model across the country would be particularly useful. In the various initiatives we looked at, we are focused more on creating the housing piece of the puzzle, and have taken the position that in most cases the support services are funded by various provincial and territorial programs, and that would continue to be the approach. We would expect, for example, if we're taking 27,000 chronic individuals out of the emergency shelter system, the caseworkers and the support workers that system now in the shelter could relocate with them to the permanent supportive housing. So there wouldn't necessarily be a big increase in the requirements for funding for supportive housing. There would be some increases, but not necessarily one for one. And we could redeploy some of those resources into the permanent supportive housing. And the assumption there is that would be a fair fiscal arrangement between the provinces and territories, picking up the support housing piece, which is an ongoing expenditure, while the feds would have essentially an upfront expenditure in the form of the capital subsidy to subsidize producing, acquiring, or building these units. Obviously not necessarily a pure 50-50 cost sharing, but certainly some degree of fairness across the two fiscal systems. So that's sort of looking at how do we accelerate the outflow piece. The more important part, if we really want to have a significant impact, is stopping the inflow into homelessness. And that really does mean significantly strengthening and enhancing our prevention measures. So basically things like eviction, mediation, so people don't even get to the point where they've been evicted, where we're able to intervene and resolve those issues resolve arrears through things like rent banks, those types of things. And maybe it's going beyond rent banks to subsidy programs that actually pay off landlords to avoid evictions, whatever is needed there. Diversion to where there are opportunities to divert folks back to the family home or their family community. Divert them into quickly being housed into existing rental homes if we can create enough supply and enough stock for that to happen, being assisted again by housing benefit type measures. And in some cases there will be some sort of short-term transitional needs depending on the particular needs of clients that need more supports. Those would still be in place but should have the ultimate goal of moving folks on into permanent housing. The implementing a by names list has been identified as a key strategy by the Alliance, and even just by having that list and starting to collect data, and certainly when I was doing some of this background work, by using the data sets, we were able to look at the flows that were happening, because we could see how many folks were coming in for each of the 15 cities that are covered by the by names list. How many new entrants were there into the system, how many who had been there before were coming back again, how many were disappearing for a while and coming back. So it was a particularly useful way to identify the nature of need and the flows that are going on, which help us to really think about how do we adjust our system planning and our use of resources around ensuring that we're using those limited resources to the greatest extent possible. And also to facilitate this, the strategy or the plan recommends that we continue with under the COVID responses. There has been a doubling of funding under Reaching Home, and we've basically tried to bake that in and say, let's keep that level of funding and perhaps even increase it going forward, so that we can continue to support community entities in redesigning and reconfiguring their programming as more housing opportunities become available, to then make sure the support services are aligned with those housing opportunities to ensure we have housing stability for the folks that are assisted. A key piece of this is expanding the affordable housing supply. I mean, I think the National Housing Strategy has proposed 100,000 new units and another 50,000 through the intensification and redevelopment of existing social housing sites. But it puts a lot of stock on the kind of the housing benefit, recognizing that most households, 85–90% of households in core housing need, primarily have an affordability problem. They're already living somewhere and we can provide them allowance, then they'll be fine. To some extent that is true, and I was a strong proponent of the housing benefit for that reason. That said, having subsequently done the analysis that I just showed you in terms of the rapid erosion of that affordable housing stock, there is a serious concern that with a very small number, an insufficient number of lower rent units, if everybody's chasing that small stock of units under 750 and they're disappearing, we are going to create inflation in the lower part of the rental market. So we do need to balance off having a housing benefit, which can be very effective, but by itself without supply, ineffective. So that's why we recommend bumping up the level of production of affordable housing to a higher levels. And here we're in the paper, we sort of set out some definitions. There is some debate about what affordable means. It means all things to all people. So for the purpose of costing and identifying what we might be doing, we've used the 80% of median market rent as the sort of the benchmark for affordable housing. That would help many folks, folks who are very low income and have a serious income problem. Then we need to supplement their income through rent supplements or housing benefits. But I think we have learned from the past, from deeply subsidized social housing, now that that's come to the end of the operating agreements, just how unsustainable that kind of housing approach is, and RGI programs tend to be in terms of making it very difficult for housing providers to continue to operate that unit and keep the units reasonably affordable. So by separating out the affordability piece for those that need it more, can make sure that the operator is actually collecting realistic rents to maintain the asset well, and can continue to ultimately leverage that asset to address capital needs and redevelopment. So in total, we're recommending 140,000 units, which is in addition to the 150,000 already identified in the National Housing Strategy. And in addition to that, as I'll come to in a moment, a specific allocation for the Urban Indigenous population. It's well known that the Indigenous population is disproportionately represented both in core housing need and in the homeless population. And it's a unique set of characteristics. While there are many marginalized and racialized groups in the needs population, the urban indigenous, or the indigenous First Nations and other indigenous Inuit and Métis have been recognized as a particular priority of the federal government. And as I say, because of the very, very high, our ability to identify them specifically as a very high percentage of need and homelessness, along with the fact that there is clearly blatant discrimination in urban rental markets. And if young or any aged Indigenous individuals or households are moving from their band communities into our cities, many of them haven't had an experience paying rent because many bands provide housing for free. So their inability to sort of understand how to function in the urban rental market makes them somewhat vulnerable. And certainly landlords who say, well, they're in arrears, they don't pay their rent, they don't look after the units well, and basically start to practice discrimination against the urban Indigenous population. And the consequence is that many of them end up being evicted and becoming homeless. So if we really want to end homelessness amongst the Indigenous population, we need to create a more sympathetic landlord and a landlord sector that's willing to house Indigenous folks. And to do so, we basically need to expand the role and capacity of the Indigenous housing, non-profit housing providers. We've only got 10,000 units of urban native housing in this country currently as a legacy from the pre-1994 programs. And so we need to try and expand that out. And we're suggesting 30,000 units, 3,000 units a year for 10 years, ideally accelerated up front. To really make a significant headway into eliminating that flow of the Indigenous households into the homeless population. I talked before about on the slide on the erosion of the stock and the issues that are associated with that, both the intensification policies and the ongoing kind of inflation, exacerbated by these large capital funds and real estate investment trusts, identifying rental property portfolios as a good asset class, which they would like to acquire in order to generate yield for their investors at the price of making housing unaffordable for lower income folks. I'll come back to in a moment how we might think about regulating that particular practice, but in the absence of any way to stop it, the strategy that I have suggested has been, if you can't beat them, join them. And that, can we enable nonprofits to emulate the behavior of these REITs and going out and buy properties that are currently sitting in the market at 85, 90% of the median market rent, which is exactly the same place we're trying to get to with new housing subsidies to build affordable housing. And certainly the 320,000 units that we lost in those 5 years between 2011 and 2016, to build units today with rents at $750 a month would require capital subsidies upwards of $200,000 a unit. So the loss of over 300,000 units just through this natural market process, basically to replace that loss would cost $60 billion. So much more than we're actually talking about in the particular proposals that we're putting forward today. So if we do nothing else, in the next 5 years potentially, we'll lose $60 billion worth of affordable housing, which there's no way the existing national housing strategy can come close to actually balancing off. So this really is a very critical area. And as I mentioned, it's because the properties are already renting at a market rent, and in many cases a moderate market rent, they are generating revenues, they are allowing the owners of the assets to generate financing, and therefore the capital cost per unit, instead of being $200,000 to build new, are generally around about $50,000 per unit. So we can have a significant impact. It doesn't add to supply, but the supply is not the issue. It's the expanding the portion of the market that's available to be preserved at low rents, and it's owned and operated by non-profit, more benevolent landlords. I think there's a real policy goal there. And so I think we need to set aside the objective of supply, which we're talking about somewhere else, and recognize as two complementary strategies, acquisition alongside supply, to make sure we're not losing more. And certainly that 300,000 units, 320,000 units in that 5 years, means that for every new unit we built under the affordable housing programs, including provincial programs in BC and Quebec, we lost 15 existing affordable units for every one we created. And that's just basically, we're running very, very quickly backwards on a treadmill in the current scenario. So plan here is to enable non-profits to go out and buy existing properties, and potentially even to create a national non-profit affordable housing investment fund of some kind to try and get to some scale. Although I think that's not something we're proposing in this particular strategy, it's something I'm working on separately. But certainly I think the two in tandem, allowing non-profits to purchase properties locally if they can, and making sure the national housing strategy enables them to do that. And then on top of that, trying to think about how we can do something like this at a larger scale. Finally, the whole issue of capital funds buying up these existing assets, and the consequence being we're losing these units out of the affordable part of the market. Can we stop it from happening? In a market system, it may be a real challenge to try and do that. We have some municipalities, in particular Montreal, has adopted a bylaw on a right of first refusal. So any multi-residential property transaction that comes on, the city has under this bylaw the right to say, okay, we actually want to intervene and we're going to buy it rather than somebody else buy it. So can other municipalities emulate that bylaw? Is it workable? It's very new. It was only adopted this spring and it hasn't really been tested in Montreal yet. But there are arguments to say that we should be expanding that across the country. The other way of thinking about this is, why are the capital funds buying these assets in the first place? And they're buying them because they're perceived as being valuable assets where there's significant potential to increase revenues and increase yield for investors. And that's happening because rent regulation allows rents to go up quite significantly. Most provinces have rent regulation that for existing tenants, if they don't move, their rent can only go up by a rent index close to the rate of inflation. But when the unit is vacated, what's called vacancy decontrol, the unit can be reset to market. So the 18% increase that I mentioned in Ottawa last year. If we could encourage the provinces to change their rent regulation to remove vacancy decontrol, then we would make these assets less attractive to the investment funds and they wouldn't be chasing them all the time. So it's a different way of getting at the problem. Rather than regulating on the purchase side, it will be regulating on the value of the asset side. So if we're talking to the federal government, obviously this is not a federal jurisdiction, it's a provincial jurisdiction. But in the 1970s, 1975, when we had very high inflation in this country and we had a federal campaign to reduce inflation in rents, particularly the federal government asked all the provinces to adopt rent controls to stop rents from going up so quickly, and they did. So it's not unprecedented for the federal government to make a similar request to the provinces to make some change in the rent regulation, recognizing the serious issue we have as a result of erosion. So basically, those are the initiatives. They're not intended to either replace or displace the national housing strategy. So they're really additive and they're adding on to the outcomes that were already funded and proposed under the national housing strategy. What it is doing is it's somewhat shifting the priority and elevating the priority of reducing homelessness in the national housing strategy, given that, as it was implied in its funding level, wasn't sufficient previously. And alongside actually increasing funding there, it's expanding significantly the production of new affordable housing across the country. So this is really just graphically showing what this means in terms of the number of units, the housing benefits. We would initially add 10,000 immediately in the first year, and then 5,000 a year for the next 10 years. Adding close to 30,000 units a year of production in the various forms of either acquisition of the motel hotels, some acquisition of existing rental apartments. The yellow, the biggest section is basically building affordable housing. Indigenous is the blue, and green would be acquiring the existing properties. But adding about 30,000 units a year to the stock, which would get us to 300,000 more affordable housing units over 10 years. In terms of what that would cost, we have two types of expenditures there. In the case of housing benefit, when we're incrementally adding new households each year, but the old ones are still there, then the costs are going to increase because it's an additive kind of cost. In the case of the new production and acquisition, it's a one-time capital grant, so we spend the money once and then the property continues to operate without ongoing assistance, except if they happen to have stacked rent-ups or housing benefit. So for the homeless benefit, we would be starting at $50 million a year, ramping up to 290, which is a very small portion of the $4 billion, which is allocated in the National Housing Strategy. So it would be relatively easy to absorb this in the existing funding parameters of the National Housing Strategy. And then on the new builds, it's about $5 billion a year, which is a significant bump from the current level of funding, which is about 1.35 billion. But having a much more significant push on creating additional stock, initially in faster forms, modular and acquisition, and subsequently building out the other more permanent supportive housing and affordable housing as well. And that would get us, for 5 billion a year, would get us to pretty well close to 300,000 units. So the total estimated cost of doing all this is just over 52 billion with a B. Those costs do not include the additional costs for support services, and estimating on 50,000 individuals or families with medium level wraparound supports would have an annual cost of about $750 million a year. Which we are assuming would be absorbed by the provinces and territories as the feds funded mainly on the capital side. Most of the 52 billion would be coming up on the federal side. And against those $750 million, much of it could be money that's being redeployed, that's already being spent. And also to the extent that not doing anything, we are paying estimates by the Housing Hub, Stephen Gates and Associates, have estimated that the cost of doing nothing is costing us $7 billion a year, or $70 billion over the 10 years. So as Tim indicated at the outset, there's a potential saving there of $18 billion. And that $7 billion a year, by the way, would be before we take into account the rapid ramping up of additional expenditures that are now being made in $3,000 a month per person to rent rooms in hotels and motels. So I suspect that 7 billion is probably closer to 10 billion or higher currently. And if that continues to go on, that would obviously be, increase the potential cost saving that's possible there. The other part of this, of course, is we're looking at, in the context of an economic recovery due to the impacts of the COVID pandemic. A lot of people are out of work. How do we redeploy people and get them back into work? Historically, construction and infrastructure have been areas and sectors that have attracted significant investment to get folks working, because there are fairly big employment multipliers as a result of investment in infrastructure. So, for example, residential construction, for every $1 million spent, it creates 5 direct and 5 indirect and induced jobs. In the case of $1 million spent in the social support sector, so essentially support services for homeless, $1 billion creates 30 jobs. So the two things together, building supportive housing and increasing employment in terms of support workers and caseworkers and so on, would have an additive effect in terms of employment generation. And so in total, the proposals would generate more than 500,000 jobs over the 10 years, essentially 50,000 construction jobs, and initially 1,500, but ramping up to 15,000 supportive housing employment positions a year as well over the 10 years. So basically, those are the proposals, and together, what this is trying to do is essentially strengthen and reframe the National Housing Strategy to make it consistent with what was subsequently adopted as the National Housing Strategy Act, with the right to housing and the progressive realization of the right to housing. So right now, the 2017 version of the National Housing Strategy is inconsistent with the subsequent legislation, so that for that reason it needs to be ramped up. And secondly, subsequent to the National Housing Strategy being adopted, CMHC's board adopted a resolution that by 2030 all Canadians have a home they can afford and meets their needs, and they certainly won't get there with the current level of funding that's in the National Housing Strategy. So we're essentially helping the CMHC board to achieve their stated goal as well. And as Evan Siddle likes to refer to as the audacious goal, I guess this is a fairly audacious plan, but it's a realistic plan. I mean, if we say, if we want to end homelessness, this is what we need to do, and this is what it'll cost. So that's it for me.
Awesome. Well, thank you very much, Steve. We've got a bunch of great questions that have come in, and I'll start going through those. A reminder to everyone, if you have a question for Steve, please put it in the Q&A panel, and we'll make sure to get to it. We've got enough time, I think, to get to most questions. So I will start with Shirley McCormick, who asked, do the income strategies in the National Housing Strategy tie in with the concept of basic income or guaranteed living income? Could a section be included that works with the GLI or the basic income? This would be effective so that all social organizations are on the same page rather than inventing their own terms and funding models. Any thoughts?
Well, I'm not sure if the question was, does the existing National Housing Strategy or does this plan? Certainly,
maybe go with this plan.
Yes, because and we don't really get into the details of the national of how a guaranteed basic income would work. In that particular section, I had acknowledged the fact that there had been considerable amount of research examining it, and obviously it's an area that has been subjected to quite significant exploration and various ways of designing it and devising it. So rather than repeat those and spend time sort of getting into more detail, we said let's set that aside and assume that somebody else is going to work on that, but it'll take a bit of time, and let's basically just work on the housing benefit piece. On the housing benefit piece, you're right in that because the National Housing Strategy delegated to the provinces and territories because it was a 50-50 cost shared program, and the provinces and territories are basically leading the design and implementation of that. It does vary considerably across the country, and there certainly will be differences in definitions, eligibility, target groups, those types of things. Perhaps this conversation and sort of as we sort of say, let's take an allocation of 50,000 housing benefits and however that's distributed across the PTs and try to basically create a consistent basis within that portion of the housing benefit, maybe the best we could do.
Mm-hmm. And I think it's clear from our perspective that, some form of guaranteed income is essential. But for the purposes of ending homelessness, certainly in the short term, we think that the combination of housing and the housing benefit expansion, we can make significant progress and in fact get to that functional zero. But ultimately, a guaranteed income could replace all of these income measures. Edward McNabb is asking, conversion of hotels and apartments is sensible, using modular housing is sensible. I didn't hear anything at all about support for new and emerging construction technologies that'll increase the speed and reduce the cost of construction. Is that something that's on your radar?
We didn't include that here because we were trying to be very focused on what are the few things we can do that sort of make sense. But certainly there is an entire agenda. I mean, CMHC has an entire program around housing innovation, $200 million, which I think they've just refreshed with some more money. They have a whole bunch of the newly announced $200 million supply challenge. So I think those things are going on a separate agenda. So it was kind of outside of our scope, but certainly there is a lot of activity in that area.
Yeah, and I would say none of our proposals really preclude diving into any of those, I would say. Do you see the core housing need group growing as a result of COVID and high unemployment?
Well, so core housing need is defined by two things. Do you experience one of three problems? You're living in housing in poor condition, are you living in overcrowded conditions, or are you spending more than 30% of your income for rent? 85–90% of folks are in the last group. So to the extent that wages have gone down substantially, one would expect. I mean, it's going to be a very, very interesting challenge in next year's census, because the census asks the question, how much did you earn last year? So the income data in the census is always 1 year behind. The incomes in 2020 are going to be very, very disturbed. And as a consequence, if one replicated the analysis on core housing need that CMHC has done in other census periods, we will see a dramatic increase in the estimate of core housing based on the fact that incomes are so much different and probably significantly lower. How pervasive that is and how long it continues to exist is another question. I think it'll be very difficult to discern that from the census alone.
Mm-hmm. Stella Lord is asking, and with regards to the data from 2011 to 2016, so the loss of naturally occurring affordable housing, as you call it, she says we've seen a dramatic increases in the lack of affordability and homelessness in Halifax and some areas in the rest of Nova Scotia in the last 4 years, as I'm sure is the case in other parts of Canada. So would these figures be low end of the ballpark? Is the sort of, is
Yeah.
there any sort of extrapolation you can do from on the growth, perhaps?
Yeah, I mean, we certainly, because we only use the census data and we don't have census data yet for 2020, 21. I think you're probably right. I mean, given that what we have seen in the last 3 or 4 years, or since 2016, are two things. One is a continuing downward trend in vacancy rates and upward trend in rents. And that would suggest that we are actually losing more affordable stock, and the problem will get worse. At the same time, we are seeing a dramatic increase, a threefold increase in the level of new rental construction in this country. So that will have some positive benefit. And I think in the immediate effects of the COVID pandemic will also have a significant softening effect on rental market vacancy rates for the two reasons I alluded to in the presentation: the removal of short-term rentals and then flowing back into the long-term rental market, and the weak demand from students as a result of staying home or staying out of the country. So if there is a silver lining in the COVID piece, I think it is some potential release of pressure on the rental markets. I would say until the spring of this year, you're absolutely right. These pressures would be building. We would have been losing more, but we may be in a bit of a reprieve.
Okay, so Maria Peluso is asking, I'm concerned that this laudable national policy is excellent. However, the actual implementation of housing policies are administered by the provincial and municipal levels of government. How will this housing policy succeed given how provincial governments are resistant to providing adequate and affordable housing for the homeless?
Well, I think, to some extent, we've tried to address that by saying, let's encourage the federal government to take on the lion's share of the cost. They have the fiscal capacity. I mean, well, no one has fiscal capacity anymore, but to the relatively speaking, compared to the provinces, the federal governments have much more fiscal capacity. The borrowing rates are obviously very low, and so we've part of the expectation here is if the federal government could go to the province and say, look, we're willing to put our money where our mouth is. Fund the production of more housing if you're prepared to redeploy and reallocate and perhaps marginally enhance your spending on support expenditures. Let's work in this. I mean, partnership is, of course, the buzzword of the era, and I think certainly that's a big. CMHC has a strong emphasis on that, and I think it is a matter of some provinces. There are different degrees of willingness and there are different degrees of fiscal capacity. But I think across the board, all of the provinces are interested in ending homelessness. All of the cities are interested in ending homelessness, much more so. And I think to some extent, by framing this around the homeless part of the broader housing crisis, when I used to do briefings on the Hill for CHRA at the Standing Committee of Finance, no matter what party the committee member was from, as soon as you started talking about homelessness, they were absolutely in agreed we had to end homelessness. As soon as you started talking about affordable housing, they didn't really know what it was. They said, well, my kid spends more than 30% of their income to buy their house. Why is this 30% affordability thing a problem? So I think by framing it in the housing on the homeless side, I think there is a strong political buy-in across all parties and across all levels of government. And I think in a constructive conversation between the federal government, by putting up their money up front and asking the provinces to partner in on the support side, I think there's, maybe I'm a Pollyanna, but I'm more optimistic that we can make some impact.
Well, and I'd have to say, Steve, that's I would echo your view that governments do seem interested, and we've been getting, I'll say, quite a positive response from parliamentarians to Recovery for All and to the proposals that we're putting. The challenge becomes the scale, right? And so convincing Parliament that they should be spending this kind of money, I think is a key part of the challenge.
Yes.
Bill Johnson is asking, the Canada Housing Benefit was to be about $2,500 or about $200 a month. Would it not have to be much larger to bridge the gap between income and rents, especially for those at high risk of homelessness, paying 50% or more of their income on rent and utilities?
Yes, basically.
Yeah.
The 2,500, that was an average, so in fairness, it could have been higher than 2,500 per household. But yeah, I think from the outset, it was a low ball estimate of what they thought they could achieve under that. I did some work for CMHC before they actually announced the Canada Housing Benefit, and I estimated it was going to cost $3 billion a year, $3.5 billion a year. So the fact they put $4 billion for 10 years suggested that it was nowhere near enough. So I think, I think we are looking at this is a top up on. So if you've got income assistance benefits that are paying in the case of a disability benefit, 400 give or take, depending which province you're in, topping up on that, if we can get into to units, obviously a bachelor 1-bedroom, if we leave aside the Vancouver, Toronto very high markets, and we're looking at rents, $700 or $800 a month, probably, $400 to $500 is probably a more realistic goal as a non-major city number, and then bigger numbers, of course, in those big expensive cities.
A couple of other things I think, Steve, in your proposals that help in this regard is one, the homeless housing benefit. Theoretically, it could be combined or stacked with other benefits and provincial benefits. The other thing is, especially with the supportive housing piece, we're proposing 100% federal capital allocation, so they would pay 100% of the cost. Some of the bigger costs related to housing construction is financing, and the thing that drives some of the rent costs. So to the extent that you can have supportive housing 100% covered by federal capital, that means there's no financing costs, and you're only really covering kind of the operations and maintenance of the building, which allows you to get naturally get a very deep subsidy on that supportive housing.
Yeah, essentially, your operating expenses, $350, $400 a month. That's basically your income assistance benefit. So it basically washes out.
Yeah. Joan McNeil is asking, have the cities that have been sites for the use of modular housing waived the usual time eating processes imposed on not-for-profits and co-ops and other social housing initiatives? Is that part of the reason the units can be up and housing people so quickly? Or how many square feet are modular units?
So the second question first, because it's easy. It's about 250 square feet for the individual unit, self-contained. But the thing is with space, I did some work a few years ago looking at micro suite designs, and particularly some of the designs that were being used in the southern US. And when you design intentionally a unit, and particularly in a modular unit where you're building it in a factory, and you build in all of your closets and features, and even things like Murphy beds, you can save a lot of space. When you create a space, 250 square foot space, and you start bringing in cupboards and wardrobes and chairs and all those kind of things, you use that space up much less efficiently. So being modular build does allow you to create much more livable 250 square feet than would be the case otherwise. The first question, I can't remember what it was now. Remind me, Tim.
Oh, sorry. Let me just find it here.
I thought the second answer was going to be quick, and then I forgot what the first one was.
I don't know where it's. Is there a reason that the units can be up and housing people so quickly?
Yes, and the answer to that is it absolutely was I think it's been documented by the City of Vancouver, and Abby Bond has done some very good presentations on this. But there was a very, very proactive, considered approach in the City of Vancouver. Instead of the normal approval process of it flows through every department, the engineering guys, the fire guys, whoever, everybody else has to have a look at it. They had everybody that was involved in the approval process meeting on a weekly basis to talk through the issues, and they found it was a very productive process, because all of a sudden folks who had been a 2 or 3% part of the whole process, they got to listen in on all the other conversations and realize why roadblocks and things were created. I think Vancouver did a very good job in really expediting that approval process. And it's probably they can take from that for their regular affordable housing stuff as well. But it was absolutely a big part of it, and it is a big part of what gets it done, in addition to the fact that just the construction stuff is faster as well. You can produce it in the factory in 6 weeks and then mount it up on site. So that 13 months to produce those units was really a 3-month production process and a 9-month planning, approval, review kind of process.
Natalie Appleyard is asking, is the campaign calling for conditions to be added to federal transfers like the Canada Social Transfer to ensure provinces and territories use these funds specifically for housing, for example, to meet the certain housing targets? I would say we aren't specifically calling for that, but any of this federal investment, the housing benefits, the capital investments, you correct me if I'm wrong, is subject to an FPT negotiation no matter what, because of the nature of housing delivery. And so to some extent there are conditions applied to federal funding one way or the other.
Yeah, when the Canada Housing Benefit was implemented, there were amendments to the bilateral agreements to add in the specific conditionality around the CHB.
Yeah.
It'll be the same thing.
Emily Parody is asking, and I think this has been partially addressed, but she's asking, the CHB alone is not enough to move people out of homelessness and keep them housed in Toronto, even with a very generous housing allowance that pays up to $600 a month. Housing workers report great difficulty securing units to help people move out of shelters. This solution also ends up costing the state a lot of money. Can you comment on other measures besides a housing benefit that are needed to address other obstacles people face in acquiring and maintaining housing in the private market, such as discrimination, mismatch between location and need, poor housing conditions, and private rental?
Yeah. I mean, to some extent, that's what we're trying to, we are emphasizing the need to create a sector-created, non-profit owned and managed stock. So adding an extra 170,000 units of housing that's owned and operated by non-profits as a way to avoid the private sector response to some of these things. And in fairness, I mean, the private sector gets painted with that same brush, but there are many private sector landlords that are quite willing participants and less predatory. So I think there has been successes working with the private sector, but of course their costs are their costs and the rents are their rents. Again, the production side, it basically creates a different type of landlord, and also, for the point Tim raised earlier, with 100% capital subsidy, it does avoid the need for that bigger benefit. If we are going to rely on the benefit, then we do need to actually elevate it to the level that it works in particular markets. And as I mentioned, the high cost markets, that benefit is probably pushing $800 to $1,000 a month in Toronto, Vancouver.
The other thing that is not in Steve's paper per se, because it's kind of out of the scope of what we asked him, but one of the points in the 6-point plan is ensuring the implementation of the right to housing in Canada, which means having a housing advocate, having access to justice, having access to some form of tribunal hearing if rights are somehow being right to housing is not being met. So the housing council, the advocate, the access to justice, and a lot of the measures that would be in implementing the right to housing, including community initiatives and public education, those things are also sort of covered in our 6-point plans, and some of what you're talking about, Emily, as would be, I think, in the right to housing implementation. One of an anonymous participant has asked, municipalities and provinces have tended to favor the development of condominiums. At one time, cooperative housing provided a good opportunity to provide affordable housing and engage the community. Why is cooperative housing no longer being advanced by our governments?
Well, I mean, cooperative housing is a particular form of non-profit housing, and it was essentially created under exactly the same program. And so we no longer have a non-profit housing program either. We have an affordable housing strategy that funds affordable housing, and co-ops can apply to build alongside non-profits. So it's really a shift in the way that programs have been branded and eligibility defined. It's not precluded. I think in fairness, the Co-op Housing Federation of Canada has been quite a strong proponent of expanding and building more co-ops. and they were obviously very involved and quite articulate in the consultations on the national housing strategy. So I think they are pushing to add more co-ops, but I think you don't necessarily have to have a specific co-op housing program. You can do it under the existing funding mechanisms.
And I would say, Steve, it's probably also safe to say that even specifically in the affordable housing elements of this proposal, you could certainly fund or finance the construction of new co-ops.
Absolutely.
I mean, we're increasing the construction production of the national housing strategy, but are largely outside of supportive housing, agnostic on kind of the form.
That's right. Yeah, and I think the point that municipalities aren't encouraging condominiums. Condominiums are being built because planning regulations and zoning doesn't allow you to zone for tenure. BC is a pioneer province in actually now creating legislation to allow cities to actually zone for rental. But historically, a multi-res property was a multi-res property, and the market dictated what got built, and what got built was condos because they generate more yield.
Yeah. Yeah.
So
another attendee is asking, how would this plan fit with the federal government initiatives to address veteran homelessness? Well, there's a couple of things I would point out. In our 6-point plan, we do have a specific measure calling on the federal government to meet its commitment to end veteran homelessness by 2025 and explore that HUD-VASH voucher type voucher program for veterans. Also, I would say that the supportive housing component and the affordable housing components of the plan could also be used, and the housing benefit here could also be used to support homeless veterans. So I think these measures combined with the measures I think the federal government is considering specifically for veterans would be effective in eliminating veteran homelessness for sure.
Yeah, I mean, I deliberately avoided enumerating specific target groups because I mean, I think it doesn't do us a lot of good from a broader policy perspective, just like slicing and dicing little segments, but also because it's a bunch of every single peer reviewer that reviewed the report added yet another group that I'd forgotten. So you're always going to forget somebody. So it was easier to say, like, here is the broad mechanism that's an umbrella that everybody can come under, as opposed to try to enumerate specific target groups.
Yeah. Another participant is saying this plan makes sense if money was the only reason people are homeless. Where does the need to focus on accessing and addressing the underlying medical issues often associated with homelessness fit in? Which recommendations cover the non-money related reasons people become homeless? Maybe I'll jump in and with a couple of points. I'll let you jump in as well, Steve. But I think there's two things that I would bear in mind. One is the supportive housing requirement, the supportive housing component. Supportive housing is designed to support people with a range of needs, including specific medical issues that require specialized on-site support. So, in fact, this proposal dramatically increases the amount of housing that is designed to support people with complex needs. The other thing is the housing benefit. Both the supportive housing and the housing benefit presume that the provinces would be implementing supports to help create housing first programs and housing first supports in both supportive housing and in scattered site affordable housing. And that is articulated in Steve's report, which allows us to increase the amount of support for people with medical issues or other complex needs. And the last thing is we've also called for an expansion of the Reaching Home program, which even outside of provincial supports allow flexibility for communities to fund some of the supports in support of our housing first based housing.
I don't think any doubt
Steve,
that's it. Yeah,
okay.
You covered it off.
Look at that. See, I answered a question on my own without the professor. It's almost like adult supervision. This is great.
Gold star for you.
Do I pass? So let me see. Sorry, I just want to make sure we get to as many questions as we can. Bruce Porter asked a question. The data on the erosion of affordable housing stock is pretty shocking. Losing 15 affordable units to every one that is to be produced. You refer to the challenges of addressing the erosion of affordable housing stock in the context of a private market, but is it not possible to regulate any purchase and redevelopment to ensure that the proportion of and/or the number of affordable units is increased and not decreased. In the Herongate case in Ottawa before a human rights tribunal, we intend to argue that this is actually a requirement of human rights codes so as to avoid displacement of racialized and other code protected groups. Obviously, it may require some available subsidies from various levels of government, but could we not make this a requirement of any development?
Well, yeah, I mean, you can regulate whatever you want. At the end of the day, are those regulations ones that politicians are willing to buy into? Is there a sufficient constituency support that would encourage them to do it? So, yeah, I mean, regulation runs the gamut. I mean, my comment was really that, I think, we are in a free market system. It's not typical. I mean, we get, anti-competition bureaus, those types of things to try and protect the consumer. And I think, it's important to make the case that there is clearly an externality kind of effect that justifies government going above and beyond in regulating, which I guess is what you're trying to do in the Herongate case. Yes, I mean, regulation can go as far as politicians are willing to go. So that's why it's important for the advocates to advocate for it, I guess.
For sure. Emily Perdy's asking, economic benefits analysis are great. How can we integrate some of the new economic analysis of the caring economy into this to better reflect gendered economic gains? Yeah,
I mean, I think historically, all the previous work I've ever done that's looked at economic benefit, the multiplier stuff, has looked at construction jobs, and it was just I happened to be looking through StatsCan's category of industrial categories and saw, well, hang on, they have ones here for support workers and those types of things. So it was I thought it was appropriate to include it. So I think the data is probably there, and I think we probably could do a better job in that area and broaden it out a bit.
A question on inclusionary zoning. Will inclusionary zoning be required with all newly built housing at market values?
Well, in this case, it's the inverse, because we would assume that most of this new affordable housing is going to get built by non-profit providers, and in order to actually be viable, they'll have to have some kind of an income mix, because the projects don't really pencil out without some market rent. So you're kind of including market as a way to achieve affordability, to achieve viability, as opposed to the way inclusionary zoning is typically used to apply to private sector developments to try and get them to include them affordable housing, as is the case, for example, on the rental construction financing initiative, where developers can get access to very cheap, very favorable lending terms to build new rental housing. But 20% of the units must then be affordable at some prescribed level. I've argued to CMHC, and they've heard me rant on this many times. If any of them are online, they won't want to hear it again. But the criteria that are used right now in the construction initiative are completely inappropriate and wrong, and they end up with rents that are way too high. But that's just a calibration issue. They could fix them if they had the will.
Roger Kishi is asking, urban Indigenous housing strategies major challenges federal provincial governments are taking a distinction-based approach government to government. Yeah. What other measures can shift this?
Right. I mean, I don't want to speak for the federal government, but we have historically had a specific program called the Urban Native Program. So within the it's back to the earlier question, I guess, and I'm going to contradict myself. But we had the non-profit program kind of had municipal non-profits, it had cooperatives, and it had private non-profits, and then it had Urban Native as a specifically funded envelope with a specific allocation. There's no reason CMHC and the National Housing Strategy could not create a funding stream for urban Native housing as a funding program. Whether that has to then be, for political reasons, approved through the distinct strategy of distinct Indigenous free groups, I guess that's more of a political question. But I think from a pragmatic point of view, I don't think there's anything stopping creating a funding stream specifically identifying that particular target group.
Yeah. Yvonne's asking a question, and this is something that we actually hear a lot when we're on advertising on Facebook. This is a common bit of pushback that we get, and I want to address it directly. There's a long waiting list, Yvonne says, for many people to get low-income housing, but with more immigrants coming into Canada, such as Ontario, then it takes other people who lived in Ontario, who were born here many, many years ago, are still waiting for housing. You can correct me if I'm wrong, Steve, but I think this idea that immigrants are taking the housing is just straight up baloney, but maybe you have a more sophisticated response.
Yeah, I mean, immigration levels are high, but there is a whole, there is a wide spectrum of different immigrants. I'm an immigrant, for an example. So, I think one has to be careful about sort of, painting all immigrants as being necessarily racialized and in deep need. In actual fact, I think the refugee category of immigration is actually quite small compared to others. Yeah, I mean, it's a vexing question. I mean, I appreciate the concern in terms of the perception of queue jumping. But we do prioritize. I mean, we've done waiting lists. Ontario certainly prioritize folks who are victims of family violence and are coming out of a shelter over anybody else on the waiting list. So it's not just immigrants. Governments have chosen to impart special status to certain groups, and they've got to the head of the queue. Whether that's fair or not, that's don't have an answer on that one.
There's another comment here from Vancouver, a person saying, here in Vancouver, hospital personnel have suggested that the majority of homeless people who do not want or are emotionally unable to stay in permanent housing. Your comments, please. I think I'd borrow from my reply before to say that's also baloney. I think the At Home Chez Soi project and success in cities all over Canada with Housing First proves fairly conclusively that that all people are capable of living in housing. Choice is kind of binary. It's choice between options, and what is so bad about the option you had that homelessness remains a better option, or what is so bad about the option you're offering that homelessness remains a better option? I think anybody and everybody is perfectly capable and has a right to housing, and to say that somehow some people are just not unable to stay in housing is ridiculous. The people aren't feral cats. I don't know, Steve, you want to add?
Good rant there, Tim. I don't think I can add to that one.
All right, I'll stop ranting. Joan is asking, do your estimates of costs assume that the actual construction work be done by profit-oriented construction companies and developers? Might it be less expensive to expand CMHC's mandate to include its own direct involvement in building activities using tradespeople, laborers, and architects working directly for CMHC and bulk purchase of high-quality material?
No.
Yeah.
I mean, talk to any non-profit in this country, and the people that provide services, whether you work in a shelter as a support worker and get paid a wage, or you work as a tiler or a plumber for a wage, there's a labor market for that kind of stuff. And whether that labor market is paid by a public agency, paid by a non-profit agency, or paid by a private developer, the labor market defines what those costs are. And I would say, if anything, certainly what we've seen in the implementation of the National Housing Strategy suggests that getting CMHC to hire and do everything, as they did do quite well in 1946, is probably not the way to go. We're not in a post-war economy anymore with a lack of resources.
Yes, exactly. Okay, so just wanted to make sure we get a couple of, we've got quite a few more questions than we have time to answer. I just want to make sure we get a couple of people that haven't asked. So Damon in Calgary is asking, do you see connecting housing to healthcare, or framing it as a form of healthcare, as an opportunity to help end homelessness in the next 10 years? I would say, that the COVID-19, the pandemic, has shown that housing is definitely healthcare, and that's certainly a way we can, a way I would position it for sure. Steve, any thoughts?
Yeah, I think the one interesting thing there, and we talk about the the $70 billion or the $7 billion a year expenditure, and a lot of the big part of that expenditure is a result of folks who are extremely vulnerable and living on the streets, ending up in emergency wards in very high, expensive medical type facilities. So there is a direct correlation with it, with the health area. It's interesting when we sort of talk about, and I've had a number of conversations with Dennis Culhane in the States on this, in terms of some of their sort of cost-effective strategies of getting to stuff, and they, so we do these things. We create supportive housing. We keep people more stably housed. We keep them out of the hospital. But is the hospital actually contributing it's the health budget contributing to these solutions. So we're basically putting all the costs of reducing health expenditures on the housing budget. So I mean, I think we need to try to articulate an argument that we are in this together. And if we're creating savings in the health system, then maybe the health system should be contributing to subsidizing some of these responses.
That's an excellent answer, and I think we will probably leave it here. Just given keeping an eye on the clock, I think we could have kept going all afternoon. Thank you, Steve. Thank you for this presentation today, but we really thank you for all the work that you've done on fleshing out the 6-point plan and the analysis that you presented. We are going to be sharing a recording of this session that we'll post on the Recovery for All website. But now we could really use your help. I mean, we think, as we mentioned before, that the government is certainly sympathetic to what we're trying to do with this campaign. But again, this is a fairly big ticket item, and we're in a unique moment in time right now where we've got a progressively oriented parliament. We've got a pandemic that has created a sense of urgency on solving homelessness and has thrown out kind of the normal in terms of the public policy discourse and what might have been seen as crazy to attempt in ending homelessness being one of those things before the pandemic are now, I think, well within the realm of opportunity. But we do need your help in reaching out to Parliament and reaching out to the government and encouraging them to support this campaign and our proposals. So I'd ask you to go to recoveryforall.ca, and if you haven't yet, please sign up. Share on social media. So if you go to our Twitter account at CAEH Homelessness, or you can also find us on Facebook. Please share the material on this, on Steve's proposals, on our 6-point plan, on the campaign. Share on social media and share with your networks. And if you can help us that way, that would be huge in building this movement to end homelessness. So with that, I will say thank you and good afternoon. Thank you very much for joining us. For those of you in the sector, thank you very much for all the work you're doing. For those of you who are experiencing or have recently experienced homelessness, know that this movement is here, and we may not have gotten to everybody yet, but we're not going to stop trying until we do. So thank you all very much. Have a terrific afternoon.
Bye.
Thank you.
Good.